Beneath a Montana blizzard, veteran Flynn Becker confronts his inheritance, an abandoned gas station, a frozen tomb for a past he's desperate to bury. He believes this is the end of the line, but this desolate place is the beginning of a dangerous, hidden truth. The station isn't a place to forget, but a place where he must face it all. Come discover the secret inside, and if you believe in second chances, please support us by subscribing to the channel. The snow began as a gentle flurry, a quiet dusting of white against the vast gray canvas of the Montana sky. But as Flynn Becker pushed his old pickup truck deeper into the mountains, the flurries thickened into a swirling, blinding curtain. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle, their rhythmic thudding a grim heartbeat counting down the miles to a destination he had no desire to reach. Flynn Becker was a man carved from the harsh landscapes he had spent his life traversing. At 32, his tall, lean frame was deceptively strong, a testament to years of military discipline. His brown hair, cut short, was already showing threads of silver at the temples. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, etched with lines of weariness. But his kind eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a depth of sorrow that the years had not managed to erase. He wore his standard uniform for the cold, an old cracked brown leather jacket over a faded plaid shirt, worn blue jeans, and sturdy work boots. He was driving toward a legacy, a word that felt hollow and bitter in his mouth. Sergeant Sam Maddox, his former commanding officer, his mentor, the closest thing he'd ever had to a father, was dead. A heart attack at 58, swift and silent in the night. And in his will, he had left Flynn the only thing he owned, a derelict, long-abandoned gas station on a forgotten highway in the middle of nowhere. The memory hit him then, unbidden, sharp as shrapnel. The Afghan sun, a merciless white fire in the sky, the taste of dust, the smell of cordite, the crackle of the radio. And Maddox's voice, calm and steady in the chaos, just before the line went dead. The image of the smoking, overturned Humvee was burned onto the back of his eyelids, a constant, flickering horror film he could never turn off. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the guilt a familiar, crushing weight in his chest. He had survived. Maddox, who had pulled him from the wreckage of his own life years before, had not. He finally saw it through the swirling snow, a ghost of a building half swallowed by the storm. A single rusted sign swung mournfully in the wind, its letters long since peeled away. This was it, the end of the line. He pulled the truck to a stop, the engine sputtering out, plunging him into a profound, wind-whipped silence. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the dilapidated structure. It was more than a rundown building. It was a monument to failure, a perfect reflection of his own life. He finally forced himself out of the truck, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. The snow was already calf-deep, and he trudged through it to the station's main door. The lock was rusted solid. With a grunt of frustration, he put his shoulder to the door and shoved. It flew open with a groan of protest, spilling him into the frigid, dusty darkness within. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of damp and disuse. The main room was a tomb of forgotten commerce, a few derelict shelves, and a dusty counter, the only remaining artifacts. But he was not alone. From the darkest corner of the room, a pair of intelligent amber eyes watched him. He froze. A low growl, more of a wary rumble than a threat, echoed in the silent space. He let his eyes adjust. It was a dog, a German shepherd, its magnificent gray and white coat matted with dirt and burrs. It was painfully thin, its ribs starkly visible, and it shivered uncontrollably, a tremor that was part cold, part fear. It was a young adult, maybe 2 or 3 years old, a stray who had found the only available shelter from the storm. Flynn's first instinct was one of weary annoyance. A stray dog was another complication, another problem he didn't have the energy to solve. Great, he muttered under his breath. Just what I need. He took a cautious step forward. The dog's growl intensified, and it flattened its ears, its body tensing. It was terrified, but it held its ground. Flynn stopped. He saw the desperation in its eyes, the fight for survival against impossible odds, and in that moment, he saw a reflection of himself, another solitary creature lost and trying to weather a storm. His frustration melted away, replaced by a wave of empathy so profound it almost buckled his knees. He slowly sank to one knee, making himself smaller, less of a threat. "Hey there," he said, his voice soft, the first gentle words he'd spoken in a long time. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog watched him, its body still tense, but the growl subsided into a low whine. It was alone, hungry, and cold. Just like him. The decision was made without him even realizing it. He couldn't turn it back out into the blizzard. "Looks like we're both stuck here for the night," he said. He watched the dog's quick, nervous reactions, the way it flinched at every sound. "You're a fast one," he observed. "I'll call you Blitz." He didn't know it then, but in that simple act of naming, in that small flicker of connection, his life had just changed forever. The world outside was a formless, howling whiteness. The blizzard raged for 2 full days, burying the gas station so completely that it felt less like a building on a road and more like a ship lost at sea. For Flynn, the isolation was both a comfort and a curse. It kept the outside world at bay, but it also trapped him with the ghosts in his own head. This time, however, he was not entirely alone. The dog, Blitz, became the anchor in his drifting solitude. The simple, primal needs of another living creature gave Flynn's days a structure they hadn't had in years. He had to keep the fire in the pot-bellied stove roaring, not just for his own warmth, but for the dog huddled beside it. He had to melt snow on the stove, not just for his own coffee, but for the dog's water bowl. He scrounged through the few remaining canned goods in the station's dusty storeroom, sharing his meager rations of beans and stale crackers. This new responsibility was a strange, unfamiliar weight, but it was a welcome one. It pulled him out of the relentless loop of his own thoughts. He couldn't just sit and stare into the flames, letting the memories consume him, because Blitz would nudge his hand with a wet nose, a silent reminder that the fire needed another log or the water bowl was empty. The dog's needs became a quiet, steady rhythm that countered the frantic noise in his mind. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. Sunlight, pale and thin, filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating a world of profound silence and pristine, sculpted snow. With the immediate threat of the blizzard gone, a new purpose took hold of Flynn. He began to clean. It started as a way to fight the crushing stillness, but it quickly became something more. He was reclaiming the space, not just from years of neglect, but from the specter of his own apathy. He swept away thick cobwebs, wiped grime from the countertops, and organized the scattered tools in the garage. As he worked, he began to see the station not just as a derelict building, but as a reflection of the man who had lived there. He saw Maddox in the neat, methodical way the oil cans were arranged, in the worn but clean patch of floor by the stove where a chair must have sat. It was during this cleaning, in a forgotten corner of the small back room that served as a bedroom, that he found it. Tucked behind a stack of old newspapers was a small, neatly folded wool blanket, worn thin and soft with age. Beneath it was a heavy ceramic water bowl, empty but clean. He picked up the blanket. It smelled faintly, almost imperceptibly, of dog. A wave of understanding washed over him. Maddox hadn't been completely alone here either. He looked over at Blitz, who was watching him from the doorway, his head cocked with curiosity. "He looked after you, didn't he?" Flynn said softly. "The old sergeant." The discovery forged a new, deeper connection in Flynn's mind. Blitz was no longer just a stray he had taken in from the cold. He was a link to the past, a living piece of the man Flynn had so deeply respected. He was the last soldier in Sergeant Maddox's command. The bond between them solidified in the quiet routines of their shared isolation. They were 2 solitary beings, both scarred by a world that had left them behind, finding a strange sort of comfort in each other's presence. When Flynn's nightmares returned, thrashing him awake in a cold sweat with the phantom sounds of rotor blades and shouting, Blitz would be there. The dog would push his head onto the cot, letting out a low, calming whine until Flynn's heart rate slowed and his breathing evened out. The dog didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He offered only his steady, non-judgmental presence, and for Flynn, that was more than enough. He was a silent, steadfast guardian against the ghosts of the past. 3 days passed in a quiet rhythm. The blizzard broke on the second morning, leaving behind a world transformed, draped in a thick, pristine blanket of white that muffled all sound. The sun, when it finally appeared, was a pale disk in a brilliant blue sky, casting long, stark shadows across the snow. The isolation remained, the roads still impassable, but the feeling of being entombed had been replaced by a serene, stark beauty. Flynn and Blitz settled into a routine dictated by survival and necessity. Mornings were for stoking the fire and melting snow for water. Afternoons were for scavenging, Flynn for more firewood or salvageable supplies, Blitz for any scent of rabbit or squirrel near the station's edge. Evenings were spent by the stove, a silent companionship forged in shared warmth and quiet understanding. For the first time since he'd left the army, Flynn felt the frantic noise in his head begin to subside. The peace, however, was not destined to last. It began on the 4th day. Flynn was in the garage, trying to fashion a crude snowshoe from a busted tire and some wire, when he first noticed Blitz's strange behavior. The garage was a cold, cavernous space, filled with the ghosts of countless repairs. The air smelled of cold oil, old rubber, and dust. Blitz had been sniffing around a pile of greasy engine parts when he suddenly froze, his body rigid, his ears pricked forward. He was focused on a section of the concrete floor near the back wall. He let out a low, guttural growl, a sound Flynn had not heard from him before. Then, he began to scratch at the floor, his claws making a sharp, scraping sound against the grimy concrete. Flynn watched for a moment. "What is it, boy? A mouse?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. He dismissed it and went back to his work. But Blitz did not stop. His scratching became more frantic, more insistent. He started to whine, a high, anxious sound that grated on Flynn's nerves. Then came the barking. Sharp, percussive barks that demanded attention. Flynn put down his tools, a flicker of irritation rising. "Hey, knock it off," he commanded. Blitz paused, looked at him with an intense, pleading expression, and then went right back to scratching and barking at the same spot. For the rest of the day, the dog was relentless. Every time they were in the garage, he would return to that one spot. His persistence was unnerving. This wasn't the playful energy of a bored dog. This was a mission. Flynn's irritation began to curdle into a different feeling, curiosity. His training whispered to him that a dog this focused, this determined, was reacting to something specific. The next morning, Flynn decided he'd had enough of the noise. He grabbed a heavy crowbar from a rusted toolbox, its cold weight familiar, in his hands. "All right, Blitz. Let's see what has you so worked up," he muttered. "If I do this, you owe me some peace and quiet." He went to the spot. Looking closer, he saw what he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just a patch of concrete. It was a section of flooring framed by metal, with one edge slightly raised, as if it had settled unevenly. A loose floorboard, concealed by years of dirt. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam and put his weight into it. The old concrete groaned in protest. With a final jarring crack, the section gave way, lifting up to reveal a dark, square cavity beneath. A wave of musty, subterranean air washed over him. Blitz stopped barking instantly, peering into the hole with his ears flattened, a low growl still rumbling in his chest. Flynn knelt down. There, resting in the dusty hollow, was a box. It was an olive-drab, military-grade footlocker, its surface stenciled with a string of numbers that meant nothing to him. But the lock did. It wasn't a standard padlock. It was a complex 5-tumbler combination lock, the kind designed to resist tampering, weather, and force. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold crept up his spine. This was from his world, from Maddox's world. He lifted the heavy box out of the hole and carried it to the main room, placing it near the warmth of the stove. He ran his fingers over the cold metal, a strange sense of reverence and dread filling him. What secrets had his sergeant deemed worthy of such protection? He stared at the lock for a long time. His mind, which for years he had tried to dull with routine and distance, began to stir. The old protocols, the training drilled into him until it was muscle memory, started to surface. He closed his eyes, his fingers finding their place on the dial. The numbers were gone, lost to time, but the feel of it, he remembered the feel of it, the slight resistance, the subtle click of a tumbler falling into place. He began to work, not with thought, but with instinct. His mind was quiet, his entire being focused on the task. It was a language he had once been fluent in. Turn right, pass the first number. Left, one full rotation, stop on the second. The world outside the lock faded away. There was only the sound of his own breathing and the soft metallic whispers of the mechanism. Click, 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 click. On the final turn, a loud, definitive clunk echoed in the silent room. It was open. With a deep breath, he lifted the heavy lid. The scent of gun oil, preserved electronics, and old paper met him. Inside, nestled in thick, custom-cut foam, were 3 items. The first was a laptop, a thick, heavy-duty machine cased in magnesium alloy, built to survive a war zone. The second was a satellite phone, an older, bulky model, but clearly well-maintained. The last item was a small, unassuming notebook bound in worn black leather. He picked it up. It felt heavy with unspoken words. He opened it to the first page. It was Maddox's handwriting, a script as neat and precise as the man himself. The pages were filled with dates, times, and cryptic notes. Financial transactions, shipping manifests, license plate numbers. It was the meticulous log of a covert investigation. He flipped through the pages, his confusion growing. This wasn't a personal journal. It was a case file. And then he saw the name. At first, it was just one among many. But as he read on, it appeared again and again, circled, underlined, connected by arrows to other names and companies. A name that meant nothing to Flynn, but which had clearly meant everything to Maddox, Alistair Kane. The discovery of the footlocker changed the air in the small station. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with unspoken secrets. The notebook lay open on the dusty counter. Maddox's neat script, a ghostly presence in the room. Alistair Kane. The name echoed in Flynn's mind, a blank space he couldn't fill. He turned his attention to the laptop. It was a piece of military hardware designed to withstand the worst conditions imaginable. Its weight felt significant, solid. He opened the lid. The screen flickered to life, bathing his face in a cold blue light. A single prompt blinked expectantly in the center of the screen. Enter password. Flynn's heart sank. Of course, it wouldn't be that easy. He typed in Maddox's service number. Access denied. He tried Maddox's birth date. Access denied. He spent the next hour trying every combination he could think of. The name of Maddox's hometown, his mother's maiden name, the coordinates of their last mission together. Each attempt was met with the same impassive, electronic refusal. Frustration began to gnaw at him. He was so close. The answers were right there, locked inside this digital fortress, and he didn't have the key. He slammed the lid shut, the sound cracking through the quiet room like a gunshot. A wave of the old helplessness washed over him, the same feeling he'd had in the desert, watching smoke plume against the sky. He leaned back, running a hand over his tired face. What did you expect, Flynn? He muttered to himself. That he would just hand it all to you? He felt a wet nose press against his hand. Blitz was looking up at him, his head cocked, a low whine rumbling in his chest. He seemed to sense Flynn's despair. It's no good, boy, Flynn said, scratching the dog behind the ears. We're locked out. Flynn got up and began to pace, the familiar, restless energy returning. He felt trapped, not just by the snow, but by his own inability to solve this final puzzle from his mentor. He stared at the contents of the room, looking for anything, any clue he might have missed. His eyes fell upon a rickety bookshelf in the corner, filled with a motley collection of dusty paperbacks, probably left by travelers over the decades. It was then that Blitz started his new campaign. He walked over to the bookshelf, his tail giving a low, hesitant wag. He stopped and nudged his nose insistently against one specific corner of the lowest shelf. He didn't bark or scratch, but his focus was absolute. He nudged it, then looked back at Flynn, then nudged it again. At first, Flynn ignored him. He was too consumed by his own frustration. "Not now, Blitz," he said dismissively. But the dog was persistent. He let out a soft whine, a gentle but firm sound of encouragement, and pushed his nose against the books again, hard enough to make them shift. Flynn sighed. He remembered the garage. He remembered the dog's unwavering certainty. A spark of hope flickered through his frustration. He walked over to the bookshelf, kneeling down to get a better look. "Okay, what is it? What do you see?" He ran his hand along the shelf where Blitz was indicating. It was just a row of cheap, tattered novels. But as he looked closer, he saw that one of them, a thick war novel with a faded cover, was pushed in slightly more than the others, creating a small shadow. He recognized the title. It was a book Maddox had given him years ago, back at the forward operating base in 2012. He pulled the book from the shelf. It felt familiar in his hands. He ran his thumb along the spine, and that's when he felt it. Not a scratch, not a tear, but a tiny, man-made notch carved into the worn leather. It was almost invisible, a detail you would never find unless you were specifically looking for it or feeling for it. The sensation of the notch under his thumb was like a key turning in his own mind. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. He and Maddox sitting in the shade of a Humvee, the air thick with heat and flies. They were talking about this very book. Maddox had tapped his finger on a specific passage. "Remember this part, Flynn," he'd said, a wry smile on his face. "In our line of work, it's the only thing that's ever really true." The quote came back to him instantly. A short, cynical phrase they had often repeated to each other after a briefing filled with half-truths and political spin. Flynn's heart began to beat faster. He hurried back to the laptop and opened the lid. The password prompt blinked at him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. How would Maddox have written it? He would have made it simple, memorable, without spaces or punctuation. Flynn took a deep breath and typed, "The first casualty is truth." He hit enter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft chime, the screen changed. "Access granted." Flynn let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He was in. The desktop was stark, professional. It was filled with encrypted files, satellite maps marked with complex overlays, and folders labeled with dates and code words. Before he could click on anything, a video file in the center of the screen launched itself. Sergeant Maddox's face filled the screen. He looked older than Flynn remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his gaze heavy with a weariness that went beyond the battlefield. He was sitting in this very room, the pot-bellied stove visible over his shoulder. He looked directly into the camera, as if he were looking right at Flynn. "Flynn," he began, his voice the same calm, steady baritone that had guided Flynn through hell and back. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and you've found my legacy. I'm sorry to have burdened you with it, son. This gas station, it's more than it seems. It's a listening post, a safe house. For years, I've been using it to watch a man named Alistair Kane." The video continued, Maddox's recorded voice filling the silent room. He explained everything. Kane was a powerful local developer who used his legitimate businesses as a front for a vast criminal enterprise, including smuggling and selling sensitive information. Then came the final, devastating blow. "The ambush, Flynn," Maddox said, his voice dropping low, filled with a cold, hard anger. "It wasn't a random attack. It was a setup. Kane sold our patrol's location to the insurgents. He did it to protect one of his smuggling routes. He sacrificed my team, our men, for profit. The video ended. The screen went black, but Maddox's image was burned into Flynn's mind. He stared at the blank screen, the sergeant's final words echoing in the profound silence. The grief that had haunted him for years was suddenly consumed by a new emotion, a white-hot rage that burned away the fog of his sorrow. This was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. The black screen of the laptop reflected Flynn's face, a stark mask of disbelief and fury. The silence in the gas station was absolute, yet his ears rang with the echo of Maddox's final words. Kane sold our patrol's location. The phrase was a litany, a drumbeat of betrayal that pounded in his skull. The grief he had carried for 2 years, a heavy, shapeless burden, was suddenly forged into something new. It became the sharp, cold, and perfectly clear edge of rage. He didn't move for what felt like an hour, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the counter. Blitz, sensing the seismic shift in the man beside him, had moved closer, resting his heavy head on Flynn's knee, a silent anchor in a storm of emotion. Finally, Flynn took a shuddering breath and pushed himself away from the counter. The time for sorrow was over. Maddox hadn't left him a property. He had left him a mission. For the next 2 days, Flynn barely slept. He consumed the contents of the laptop with the intensity of a soldier memorizing a battle plan. The files were a labyrinth of Kane's criminal empire, meticulously documented by Maddox. There were encrypted spreadsheets detailing money laundering schemes that funneled cash through offshore accounts. There were folders of surveillance photos showing Kane meeting with known arms dealers in discreet locations. There were audio files, distorted recordings of phone calls discussing shipments and payoffs. Flynn's past life, the skills he had tried so hard to bury, came flooding back. He analyzed troop movement patterns, only now they were shipping routes. He decoded enemy chatter, only now it was financial jargon hiding illegal transactions. He was no longer a lost veteran adrift in grief. He was an intelligence analyst again, and he had a target. The station was no longer a refuge from the world. It was an outpost, a command center. He and Blitz were its sole occupants, a unit of 2 holding the line. It happened on the 3rd day, after the revelation. The sun was high, glaring off the endless expanse of snow. Flynn was deep into a file detailing a transfer of shell corporations when Blitz, who had been dozing by the stove, suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled, and a low growl, almost too quiet to hear, rumbled in his chest. A moment later, Flynn heard it too. The faint, powerful hum of a high-performance engine, a sound utterly alien to the winter silence of this remote valley. He moved to the window, wiping away a patch of condensation. Far down the single-lane road, a black shape was approaching, moving with a confident speed that defied the icy conditions. It was a large, luxury SUV, its tinted windows gleaming like obsidian against the snow. Flynn's entire body went on alert. "Company's coming, buddy," he said quietly. Blitz was already on his feet, his body tense, his gaze locked on the approaching vehicle. The SUV pulled smoothly to a stop where the station's driveway disappeared under the snow. The engine went silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, 2 doors opened in unison. 2 men emerged, their forms stark against the white landscape. They were dressed in expensive, dark wool overcoats and perfectly polished dress shoes that were absurdly impractical for the deep snow. They looked as out of place here as a rattlesnake in a blizzard. One man was tall and lean, with silver hair slicked back from his forehead and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He moved with an easy, predatory grace. The other was shorter but built like a brick wall, his neck as thick as Flynn's thigh, his face a stony, expressionless mask. He walked a half-step behind the silver-haired man, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes scanning everything. They trudged through the snow toward the station's main door. Flynn didn't move from his position by the laptop. He simply watched them approach. Blitz moved to stand directly in front of him, his body a rigid line, the growl in his chest now a low, continuous warning. The silver-haired man pushed the door open without knocking, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. He paused in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. The dusty, disordered room, the glowing stove, Flynn standing impassively by the counter, and the large German shepherd barring his path. "Mr. Becker?" the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "My name is Mr. Finch. This is my associate. We represent Mr. Alistair Kane." Flynn said nothing. He simply met the man's gaze. Mr. Finch's smile widened slightly. Mr. Kane was a great admirer of Sergeant Maddox. He was so sorry to hear of his passing. He is also aware that the sergeant left you this charming piece of property. It holds a certain sentimental value for him. As such, he has authorized me to make you a very generous offer to take it off your hands. A cash offer, $500,000. Today. The number hung in the air, obscene and absurd. $500,000 for a derelict gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was a test, a lure. Flynn remembered Maddox's voice from the video. "They'll come for this place, Flynn. They'll try to buy it, or they'll try to take it." Blitz took a step forward, his growl deepening. The fur along his spine was raised. He was a gray and white wall of controlled aggression, ready to spring. Flynn placed a hand gently on Blitz's back, a silent command to hold. He looked past Mr. Finch to the silent brute behind him, then brought his gaze back. His voice, when he finally spoke, was flat and cold as the winter air. "The property is not for sale." The smile on Mr. Finch's face vanished. It didn't fade. It was simply gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Becker. This isn't a negotiation. Mr. Kane is a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants." "Then he's about to be disappointed," Flynn replied, his voice unwavering. Mr. Finch stared at him for a long, hard moment. His eyes flickered down to Blitz, then back to Flynn. It was a look of appraisal, like a butcher sizing up a piece of meat. "A man in your position, all alone out here. It would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen. Accidents are so common in this weather." The threat was unmistakable. "Get off my property," Flynn said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Mr. Finch held his gaze for another second, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to his associate. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door. The large man followed, his eyes never leaving Flynn until the door swung shut, plunging the room back into silence. Flynn watched through the window as they got back into the SUV. It turned around in a powerful, churning spray of snow and sped back down the road, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. He let out a slow breath, his hand still resting on Blitz's back. The dog's body was still tense, the growl a faint vibration under his palm. The battle lines had been drawn. The war had come to him. The departure of Mr. Finch and his silent associate left a vacuum in the gas station, a chilling silence that was more menacing than their spoken threats. The black SUV was a ghost that haunted the edge of Flynn's vision for the rest of the day. He stood watch at the window until dusk painted the snow in shades of purple and gray, his hand resting on Blitz's head, the dog a warm, solid presence at his side. The message had been delivered. This was Kane's territory, and Flynn was an intruder. The first strike came 2 nights later. Flynn was jolted from a shallow, restless sleep by the sudden, profound darkness. The steady, comforting hum of the generator had died, and the faint glow from the single lamp he kept on was extinguished. The room was plunged into an inky blackness, the kind that felt absolute. Blitz was instantly on his feet, a low, menacing growl vibrating through the floorboards. Flynn's training took over before his conscious mind could even process the situation. He was out of bed, his hand reaching for the heavy iron crowbar he now kept beside him. He moved silently to the window, peering out into the moonless night. Nothing. Just the vast, empty expanse of white under a star-dusted sky. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice a low murmur in the dark. He knew this was no accident. The generator was old but reliable, and he had filled it with fuel that afternoon. This was a probe, a test of his defenses. He waited for a full 10 minutes, listening to the sounds of the night, his senses on high alert. When he was certain no one was approaching, he grabbed a flashlight and went outside, Blitz sticking to his side like a shadow. The cold was a physical blow, sharp and biting. He made his way to the generator shed. The padlock was untouched, but the fuel line had been expertly crimped and severed, a small, deliberate act of sabotage designed to look like a mechanical failure. It was a professional job, clean, quiet, deniable. He spent the next hour working by flashlight in the freezing cold, his fingers numb as he bypassed the damaged line. When the generator finally roared back to life, flooding the station with light and sound, it wasn't a feeling of victory he felt, but one of grim resolve. This was just the beginning. The water was next. The following afternoon, the tap in the small kitchen sputtered, coughed out a stream of rusty water, and then ran dry. He knew without even looking that the well pump, located 100 yards from the station, would be similarly disabled. Kane was systematically cutting his lifelines, trying to freeze him out, to make his position untenable. That evening, as Flynn melted snow on the stove for drinking water, a sense of profound isolation settled over him. Kane didn't need to send men with guns. He could use the landscape itself as a weapon. He could turn the silence, the cold, the sheer emptiness of this place against him. It was in that moment of despair that Flynn's mindset shifted completely. He was no longer just protecting a secret, he was defending a position. The gas station was not a home, it was a fortress, and it had just come under siege. The next few days were a blur of activity. Flynn worked with a methodical, focused energy he hadn't felt in years. He boarded up the large plate glass windows of the main room, leaving only small slits to see through, transforming the welcoming front into a blind, defensive wall. He scavenged through the garage, finding old chains to brace the doors and sheets of scrap metal to reinforce the weaker sections of the walls. He created a perimeter, a series of tripwires made from fishing line and tin cans that would alert him to any approaching footsteps. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a soldier again, defending his outpost. Throughout it all, Blitz was his constant companion. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He patrolled the station with a quiet intensity, his ears constantly twitching, his nose testing the wind. He became Flynn's early warning system, his sixth sense. He would often freeze, a low growl rumbling in his chest, long before Flynn could hear the sound of a distant truck on the main road. More than that, he was Flynn's morale. In the long, quiet hours, when the crushing weight of his isolation threatened to overwhelm him, Flynn would look down at the loyal dog and find the strength to keep going. The official visit came on a brilliantly sunny morning, the light making the fortifications look stark and paranoid. A county sheriff's cruiser, its lights off, crunched to a stop outside. A man in a crisp brown uniform got out. He was in his late 50s, with a thick middle that strained the buttons of his shirt and a face made florid by the cold. His name tag read Sheriff Brody. He approached the door cautiously, his eyes taking in the boarded-up windows. "Mr. Becker?" he called out, his voice a folksy, non-threatening boom. "Sheriff Brody. Just making a friendly wellness check. Haven't seen much activity out here." Flynn opened the door a crack, leaving the chain on. Blitz stood just behind him, visible to the sheriff, silent but imposing. "I'm fine, Sheriff." Brody's friendly smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's good to hear. You know, we've had some procedural questions down at the county office about this property. The transfer of ownership from Sergeant Maddox seems to have some irregularities. We just want to make sure everything is above board, that you're not, trespassing." The word hung in the air, a perfectly legal and perfectly veiled threat. "The will was clear," Flynn said, his voice flat. "My lawyer can send you the paperwork." "I'm sure he can," Brody said, his smile tightening. "It's just, this is a valuable piece of land. Mr. Kane has big development plans for this valley. A man living out here in a condemned building, it complicates things. It would be a lot simpler for everyone if you just moved on." There it was. The connection, laid bare. The law wasn't here to protect him. The law worked for Cain. "I'm not going anywhere," Flynn said. Sheriff Brody's facade of friendliness finally dropped. His eyes went cold. "You're making a mistake, son. A big one." He tipped his hat, turned, and walked back to his cruiser without another word. As Flynn watched him drive away, the true scale of the fight ahead became terrifyingly clear. He was one man, with one dog, against a man who owned the law, the land, and everyone on it. He closed the door and leaned his forehead against the cold wood. He was completely, utterly alone. He felt a familiar pressure behind him and looked down. Blitz was leaning his full weight against Flynn's legs, a silent, unwavering declaration, not completely alone. Sheriff Brody's visit was the final confirmation. The thin veneer of civilization had been stripped away, leaving Flynn and Blitz on an island, surrounded by a sea of hostility, controlled by Alistair Cain. The days that followed were taut with a new kind of tension. Flynn no longer just watched for threats, he anticipated them. He spent his time meticulously studying the data on the laptop, cross-referencing names and dates, trying to build a complete picture of Cain's operations. The work was all-consuming, a return to a world he understood, a world of strategy and enemies. The attack came on the fourth night after Brody's visit. A storm had moved in at dusk, a swirl of wind and fine, stinging snow that reduced visibility to near zero. The world outside the boarded-up windows was a howling white chaos. It was the perfect cover for an intrusion. Flynn was asleep in his chair, the laptop dormant on the counter beside him. He had been up for nearly 20 hours, and exhaustion had finally claimed him. He was dreaming of the desert, of the sun beating down, when a sound from the real world pierced his subconscious. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, guttural growl from the floor beside him. His eyes snapped open. The room was dark, save for the faint orange glow from the stove's air vents. Blitz was on his feet, his body rigid as stone, staring intently at the front door. The fur on his back was a bristling ridge, and the growl was a continuous, threatening vibration. Flynn was instantly awake, his fatigue vanishing in a surge of adrenaline. He listened, straining to hear past the scream of the wind. And then he heard it. A faint, metallic scraping sound near the main entrance. They were working on the reinforced lock. He moved without a sound, his socked feet silent on the cold floor. He grabbed the heavy crowbar, its weight a cold, grim comfort in his hand. He flattened himself against the wall next to the door, his heart pounding a steady, controlled rhythm. He put a hand on Blitz's head, applying gentle pressure. The dog's growl subsided into a tense, vibrating silence. He understood. Wait. The scraping stopped. There was a pause, then a heavy thud as a shoulder hit the door. The wood groaned, but the chain and the heavy bar Flynn had wedged under the knob held firm. Another thud, harder this time. The door frame splintered. A third, violent slam, and the door burst inward, the chain snapping from its mooring with a sharp crack. Two figures spilled into the room, big men bundled in dark winter gear, their faces obscured by ski masks. One was a mountain of a man, carrying a thick pry bar. The other was slightly smaller, quicker, and held a large flashlight that cut a blinding swath through the darkness. "Find the laptop," the bigger man grunted, his voice muffled by the mask. The flashlight beam swept across the room, blinding Flynn for a second. It settled on the counter where the laptop sat. That was the moment Flynn chose. "Blitz, now," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear. It was not a bark of alarm, but the roar of a protector. Blitz launched himself from the darkness, a gray and white missile of muscle and fury. He hit the larger man squarely in the chest, the impact driving the intruder back with a choked cry of surprise and pain. The man stumbled, his pry bar clattering to the floor, as he struggled with 70 pounds of enraged German Shepherd. The distraction was all Flynn needed. He moved from the shadows, a blur of motion. The second intruder, startled by the dog's attack, was turning his flashlight toward the commotion. Flynn swung the crowbar in a short, brutal arc, connecting with the man's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. The flashlight spun away, and the man screamed, clutching his shattered arm. Flynn didn't hesitate. He followed through with a swift, disabling kick to the man's knee. The intruder collapsed in a heap, howling in agony. Flynn spun back to the first man, who had managed to throw Blitz off. The dog was already scrambling back to his feet, ready to re-engage. The intruder, seeing his partner down, made a decision. He abandoned the mission, turning to flee back out the broken door. Flynn let him go. He stood over the writhing man on the floor, the crowbar held ready. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. The man on the floor just whimpered, cradling his broken arm. Flynn could see the raw terror in the man's visible eye above the mask. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the wind. A siren, faint but growing closer. Sheriff Brody, coming to the scene of the crime he likely already knew about. The man on the floor heard it too, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Flynn made a split-second calculation. He couldn't be found here with a crippled intruder. He backed away. "Get out." The man needed no further encouragement. He scrambled to his feet, half crawling, half stumbling out into the storm, dragging his useless leg behind him. Flynn watched him disappear into the swirling snow. He quickly checked on Blitz, running his hands over the dog's body, searching for injuries. Blitz was breathing hard, a small cut on his muzzle, but otherwise unharmed. He licked Flynn's hand, his tail giving a short, triumphant wag. Flynn let Sheriff Brody find him sitting calmly by the stove, nursing a cup of coffee he'd hastily prepared. Brody took in the scene, the shattered door, the items knocked over in the scuffle. "Heard a disturbance on my way through," the sheriff said, his tone bored. "Looks like you had a break-in." "Two men," Flynn said calmly, "tried to rob the place. They ran off when they heard you coming." Brody scribbled a few notes in a small pad. "Any idea what they were after?" "Probably just looking for cash." "It is a gas station," Flynn lied smoothly. "Right," Brody said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. He shone his flashlight around the floor. "Well, they didn't get anything. Looks like a failed petty burglary to me. I'll file the report, but with no witnesses and this storm, don't expect much. Case closed." He didn't ask if Flynn was hurt. He didn't offer any assistance. He just tipped his hat and left. After the cruiser's taillights vanished, Flynn finally allowed himself to breathe. He had won the battle, but Brody's perfunctory visit was a stark reminder that he was still losing the war. As he began to clean up the mess, his foot kicked something small and hard under the counter where it had been knocked during the fight. He bent down and picked it up. It was a smartphone, its screen cracked but still glowing. One of the intruders had dropped it. He swiped the screen open. It wasn't even locked. The call log was right there. The last outgoing call, made just 30 minutes before the attack, was to a number labeled with a single initial, K. Flynn felt a cold smile touch his lips. They had failed. They hadn't gotten the evidence, and in their failure, they had given him a new piece. The first piece of hard, tangible proof that connected Alistair Kane directly to the violence that had just shattered his peace. The cracked smartphone was a cold, hard piece of victory in Flynn's hand. It was proof, a direct line from the violence at his door to the man who had ordered it. But as the adrenaline from the fight subsided, a sobering reality set in. The phone was a weapon, but he had no one to give it to. Sheriff Brody was a pawn, and any evidence handed to him would simply disappear. He was still alone, still besieged. He looked at the items from the footlocker, now arranged on the counter like religious artifacts. The laptop, Maddox's notebook, and the bulky satellite phone. For days, he had seen the phone as a last resort, a signal flare to be fired only in the most dire of circumstances. The midnight intrusion had been that circumstance. He picked up the heavy device. It felt antiquated, but solid. He powered it on, and after a moment, the small monochrome screen glowed to life, displaying a signal strength indicator. He opened Maddox's notebook to the last page. There, under the heading Contingency, was a single satellite phone number and a short alphanumeric string labeled key. Flynn's training kicked in. It was a simple book cipher, an old-school method that was nearly impossible to crack without knowing the source text. He knew instantly which book to use. He retrieved the war novel from the shelf, its spine now feeling like a lifeline. He spent the next 20 minutes painstakingly composing a short, encrypted message. He kept it brief, professional, devoid of emotion, inheritor of Maddox's legacy. Position compromised. Hostile action confirmed. Require assistance. He transmitted the message into the void. A digital prayer sent to a number he didn't know, to a person he couldn't name. And then, he waited. The next 3 days were the longest of his life. The silence of the valley pressed in on him, no longer a comfort, but a source of gnawing anxiety. Had the message been received? Was the contact still active? Or had he just announced his presence to a deadline, or worse, one that was now monitored by Kane's people? He repaired the door as best he could, his senses on a knife's edge, watching the empty road for any sign of movement. Blitz was a shadow at his heels, the dog's quiet presence the only thing keeping Flynn's spiraling thoughts in check. On the 4th morning, a vehicle appeared. It wasn't the menacing black of Kane's SUV. This was an old, dark green Subaru, its body caked with road salt and mud, a testament to a long, hard journey. It navigated the icy road with a practical, no-nonsense competence and pulled to a stop near the station. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was not what he expected. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with a lean, wiry frame that spoke of restless energy. Her dark hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail. She wore a heavy-duty parka, worn jeans, and practical snow boots. But it was her face that held his attention. It was a landscape of sharp angles and deep-set, intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was a weariness in her expression, but beneath it lay a core of tempered steel. She stood by her car for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the station, noting the boarded-up windows and the crudely repaired door. She was assessing the tactical situation. Blitz stood beside Flynn at the window, a low, uncertain growl in his chest. The woman began to walk toward the station, her steps sure and deliberate in the snow. Flynn met her at the door, opening it only as far as the new chain would allow, the crowbar in his hand, just out of sight. "Flynn Becker?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, like a rusty gate, the voice of someone who drank too much coffee and slept too little. "Who's asking?" Flynn countered, his eyes narrowed. The woman didn't seem offended by his hostility. She seemed to expect it. "My name is Maya Joshi. I got your message." The name meant nothing to him. "I don't know you." "No," she agreed, her sharp eyes meeting his. "You don't, but Sam Maddox did. He told me that if this day ever came, his replacement would be a man who trusted his gut more than a stranger's words." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "He also told me to tell that man, the first casualty is always the truth." The password, the phrase from the book, the key to the laptop, a wave of relief so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He fumbled with the chain and opened the door. "Get inside." She stepped into the room, bringing the scent of the cold and the road with her. She gave Blitz a wide, respectful berth. Her eyes scanned the interior, landing on the open laptop, the notebook, and the dropped smartphone charging on the counter. "You've been busy," she said, a hint of grim approval in her voice. "Who are you?" Flynn asked again, his tone softer now. "I'm an investigative journalist," she said, unzipping her parka. "Or I was. Now I'm mostly a professional pain in the neck for men like Alistair Kane. Sam and we were partners on this for almost 5 years. He was my source, my eyes and ears on the ground." She walked over to the laptop, her movements economical and precise. Sam was getting close. Flynn, closer than he'd ever been. "Kane is finalizing a deal, a big one. He's brokering the sale of a shipment of stolen military-grade explosives to an international terror cell. That's why he needed your team out of the way back then. They were patrolling too close to his supply route. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place, and the picture it completed was uglier than Flynn could have imagined. This wasn't just about covering up a smuggling route. It was about facilitating mass murder. This deal is happening soon, Maya continued, her finger hovering over a map on the screen. Within the next week, the evidence Sam collected, everything on this laptop, is the only thing that can expose him and stop that shipment from going through. Flynn looked from her determined face to the loyal dog at his side. The weight of his mission had suddenly grown tenfold. It was no longer a quest for vengeance, a settling of an old score. It was a race against time to prevent a future catastrophe, to stop Kane from creating more Gold Star families, more men like him, haunted by ghosts. "What's the plan?" Flynn asked, his voice steady. He was no longer a man adrift. He was a soldier with an ally and a clear objective. Maya looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of a smile in her tired eyes. "The plan," she said, "is we use everything Sam gave us, and we burn Alistair Kane's whole world to the ground." The arrival of Maya Joshi transformed the gas station. What had been a lonely outpost of defiance became a bustling command center. The air, once thick with solitude and tension, now crackled with the energy of a shared purpose. Flynn and Maya worked side by side, a strange but effective team. He was the soldier, methodical and disciplined, seeing the data in terms of threats, assets, and tactical weaknesses. She was the journalist, relentless and intuitive, connecting names to faces, following the money, and weaving the disparate threads of information into a coherent narrative of corruption and greed. They fell into a rhythm. Days were spent hunched over the laptop, fueled by black coffee and a grim determination. They cross-referenced Maddox's notes with public records Maya pulled up on her own encrypted satellite link. They pieced together the final details of Kane's operation, the shell corporation used to purchase the explosives, the remote, abandoned airfield designated for the exchange, and the likely timetable. Evenings were for strategy, for planning how to get the mountain of evidence to the right federal authorities without it being intercepted by Kane's network of influence. Through it all, Blitz was a constant, calming presence. He seemed to understand that Maya was an ally. He would often lie at her feet as she worked, and he accepted the occasional scratch behind the ears with a low, contented sigh. For Flynn, the dog was a living reminder of what he was fighting for. In the moments when the sheer scale of Kane's evil threatened to overwhelm him, he would look at Blitz, at his simple, unwavering loyalty, and his resolve would harden. They were deep into their third day of collaboration, tracing the final transaction that funded the explosives purchase when it happened. They were completely absorbed, the outside world having faded away, reduced to the numbers and names on the screen. Blitz, who had been lying quietly by the door, let out a single, sharp bark. Flynn looked up, instantly alert. "What is it, boy?" Before he could react, the front door, still damaged from the last attack, was kicked open with such force that it ripped from its top hinge. Two men, dressed in black tactical gear and ski masks, stormed in. They were not the clumsy thugs from before. These men moved with a silent, fluid efficiency that screamed of professional training. One pointed a handgun at Maya, freezing her in place. The other moved directly toward Blitz. The dog met him with a ferocious roar, launching himself forward. But the man was prepared. Instead of fighting, he deployed a large, heavy blanket, expertly enveloping the dog in a single, practiced motion. Blitz's barks were instantly muffled as he thrashed within the thick fabric. The man scooped up the struggling bundle and was out the door before Flynn could even cross the room. The entire event took less than 5 seconds. Flynn started to charge after them, a guttural yell of rage tearing from his throat. "Flynn, don't!" Maya shouted, her voice sharp with warning. The man with the gun was still there, his weapon steady, his unseen eyes behind the mask tracking Flynn's every move. Flynn froze, his body trembling with a helpless fury he had not felt since the ambush. He watched as the second man threw the bundled, struggling form of his dog into the back of a waiting van. The doors slammed shut. The man with the gun backed out slowly, the weapon never wavering, then turned and sprinted to the van. The vehicle sped away, spraying a plume of snow, and vanished down the road. The silence they left behind was a physical wound. Flynn stood in the doorway, staring at the empty road, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. The cold air bit at his skin, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was a vast, hollow emptiness where Blitz's presence used to be. "Flynn," Maya said gently, coming to stand beside him. "They took him," Flynn whispered, his voice cracking. "They took my dog." The soldier was gone. The analyst was gone. All that was left was a man whose best friend had just been stolen from him. The rage was still there, but now it was underpinned by a cold, sickening dread. The satellite phone on the counter began to ring, its electronic chirp unnaturally loud in the silent room. They both knew who it was. Flynn walked back inside, his movements stiff, robotic. He picked up the phone. "Becker," he said, his voice flat. "I trust my associates were efficient," Alistair Kane's voice replied, smooth and devoid of any emotion. It was the first time Flynn had heard the voice of the man who had destroyed his life. "I have your animal. He is unharmed, for now." "What do you want?" Flynn ground out, his knuckles white on the phone. "The question is, what do you want, Mr. Becker?" Kane said conversationally. "I want my property. The laptop, the notebook, any copies you've made, everything. You, on the other hand, want your pet. It seems we have the basis for a simple transaction." Flynn could hear Blitz barking in the background, a frantic, muffled sound that tore at his heart. "You bring everything to the old quarry off Highway 89 at sunrise," Kane continued. "Come alone. If I see your journalist friend, if I see any sign of police or federal agents, the dog dies. It's that simple. Do we have an agreement?" Maya was shaking her head frantically, mouthing the word number. She knew it was a trap. They would take the evidence and kill them both. But Flynn wasn't thinking about strategy anymore. He wasn't thinking about the mission or the explosives or justice for his fallen comrades. All he could hear was his dog's desperate barking. All he could see was the image of Blitz being bundled away into the darkness. The mission had been reduced to a single, primal objective. "Sunrise," Flynn said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I'll be there." He ended the call and threw the phone onto the counter. He looked at Maya, his eyes burning with an intensity that startled her. The grief-stricken veteran was gone. The calculating soldier was gone. In their place was something else entirely. Something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. A predator whose pack had been threatened. "It's a trap, Flynn," Maya said, her voice pleading. "We can't just hand it over." "He has my dog," Flynn said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This ends now." The moments after the call ended were a vortex of cold fury. Flynn moved with a purpose that bordered on terrifying, grabbing the bag containing the laptop and Maddox's notebook. His world had narrowed to a single point: the quarry at sunrise. "Flynn, stop and think," Maya pleaded, stepping in front of him, her small frame a surprising obstacle. "This is exactly what he wants. He's counting on you being a soldier, running headfirst into the line of fire, driven by emotion." "He has my dog," Flynn repeated, his voice a low growl. "That's all that matters." "I know," she said, her voice softening, but losing none of its intensity. "And that's why we are going to get him back. But we're going to do it our way, not his." She pointed to her own rugged laptop, which was displaying a detailed satellite map. A single red dot blinked steadily. "He made a mistake, Flynn. He used a satellite phone. I was able to get a lock on his signal while he was talking. He's not at the quarry. The quarry is where his men will be waiting to kill you and bury the evidence. Kane himself is here." She tapped the screen, zooming in on an industrial area a few miles outside the nearest town. The red dot pulsed over a large, isolated structure. An abandoned warehouse. Hope, cold and sharp, cut through Flynn's rage. He looked from Maya's determined face to the map. She was right. He had been thinking like a wounded animal. He needed to think like a soldier again. "He's expecting me at sunrise," Flynn said, his mind already shifting, calculating. "That gives us a few hours." "What's the plan?" Maya asked. "The plan is, you get this evidence out," he said, tapping Maddox's laptop. "You send everything you have to your federal contacts the second you hear from me. I'm going in, but I'm not going in blind." For the next 2 hours, they worked. Maya made a perfect copy of the laptop's hard drive onto a small, encrypted, external drive. Flynn prepared a decoy bag containing the original, now wiped laptop and a few random notebooks. He gathered his meager supplies: a flashlight, a length of rope from the garage, and the heavy iron crowbar that had served him so well. He was going into a gunfight with a piece of metal, but he had the element of surprise. He left an hour before dawn, melting into the pre-dawn darkness in Maya's mud-splattered Subaru. The warehouse was a hulking silhouette against a sky just beginning to turn from black to a deep indigo. He parked a half-mile away and approached on foot, moving through the snow-covered trees with a ghostly silence he hadn't used in years. He scouted the perimeter. 2 men were stationed at the front entrance, their breath pluming in the frigid air. A third was in a vehicle parked near the loading docks. They were all focused outward, waiting for a target to approach from the road. No one was watching the back. Flynn found a rusted-out ventilation grate near the base of the rear wall, just as Maddox's old schematics on the laptop had shown. He worked the crowbar into the seam, prying it open with a low, groaning protest of metal. He slipped inside, into the cold, cavernous darkness of the warehouse. The air smelled of rust, damp concrete, and something else, the faint, familiar scent of dog. He followed it, moving silently through rows of decaying crates and machinery. He heard voices from an office in the far corner, and the sound he had been straining to hear, a low, unhappy whine. He peered through a grimy window into the brightly lit office. Alistair Kane was there, looking exactly as he had in Maddox's surveillance photos, a man exuding an aura of calm, untouchable power. Mr. Finch stood beside him, and in the corner, tied to the leg of a heavy metal desk, was Blitz. He was unhurt, but his eyes were wide with fear and confusion. He whined again, and Kane's associate gave the leash a sharp tug. A fresh wave of cold fury washed over Flynn, but he forced it down, channeling it into focus. He needed a diversion. He found a loose electrical conduit on the wall and, using the crowbar, wrenched it from its housing, creating a shower of sparks and a loud, crashing noise in the opposite corner of the warehouse. As expected, Finch and one of the guards from the front went to investigate the sound. Kane remained in the office, annoyed but not alarmed. That was his second mistake. Flynn moved. He burst into the office, a silent, sudden force of nature. Kane looked up, his expression of arrogant calm shattering into pure shock. Before he could even call out, Flynn was on him, striking the nerve cluster in his shoulder with the butt of the crowbar. Kane collapsed with a choked gasp, his arm going limp. Blitz erupted into a frenzy of barking, his fear replaced by joyous recognition. Flynn quickly untied him, putting a finger to his lips. "Easy, boy. Quiet now." He grabbed Kane, hauling the groaning man to his feet. At that moment, Finch and the guard returned. They stopped dead, their guns half raised, seeing their boss held hostage. "Drop them," Flynn said, his voice flat and cold as ice. "Or he dies." They hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, the wail of distant sirens cut through the morning air. Maya had done her part. Flynn had used the satellite phone to send her a one-word go signal the moment he had Blitz. Finch's eyes widened in panic. The game was over. He and the guard dropped their weapons. The sun was just beginning to crest the mountains when Flynn walked out of the warehouse, his dog at his side, leaving Kane and his men for the federal agents swarming the property. He didn't look back. Months later, the snow was gone, replaced by the vibrant green of a Montana spring. The gas station was unrecognizable. A new coat of white paint gleamed in the sun. The boarded-up windows were gone, replaced with clean, clear glass. The old, swinging sign had been taken down. In its place was a newly carved wooden sign that read, "The Maddox Blitz Rest House." The inside was clean and bright, transformed into a welcoming lounge with comfortable chairs and fresh coffee. A young veteran with a shy three-legged mutt sat by the window, talking quietly with Flynn. Kane and his entire network had been dismantled. The story Maya broke was national news, a sprawling epic of corruption and treason, all brought down by a dead sergeant's persistence, a journalist's courage, and a veteran's love for his dog. Later that evening, Flynn stood outside, throwing a worn tennis ball for Blitz across the grass. The dog, now healthy and happy, bounded after it with joyful abandon. Flynn watched him, a real, genuine smile on his face. The ghosts of the desert were finally quiet. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was a man defined by what he had built. He had inherited a legacy of war and secrets, and from it, he had forged a new one of peace, of loyalty, and of second chances. Sometimes, the deepest wounds are healed not by time, but by a loyalty so pure, it reminds us how to live again. Flynn and Blitz found their second chance. A quiet peace built from the ashes of the past, proving that the greatest legacies are the ones we build with love. If their journey has touched your heart, we hope you'll become part of our community. Your support, through a simple like, a comment, or by sharing this story, helps us continue to honor these incredible bonds. We invite you to subscribe so you never miss a tale, and the journey continues right now with a new story waiting for you on the screen.